It seems almost every day there's an article or some opinion piece talking about the gender disparity in tech and why this is a problem. So you can imagine my surprise when I stumbled upon this article by The Guardian that's titled, "We Can Teach Women to Code, but that just creates another problem." But isn't that the point here? Whenever people are critical of diversity or critical of equality, aren't they talking about exactly this? The fact that you can teach more women to code and fix the gender imbalance within tech, but that still leaves another problem. That problem being that you don't simply just want equality of opportunity, but you also want equality of outcome. Unfortunately, the author of this article, Miriam Posner, doesn't seem like the person to address a point like that, considering she writes some pretty outlandish things like, "But here's the problem. The technology industry enforces a distinct gender hierarchy between front-end and back-end development." This statement could not be any more untrue. This is just completely false. There is no enforcer in the industry whatsoever. I've worked as a front-end developer, I've worked as a back-end developer, I've worked as a full-stack developer, and I've worked with men and women who have worked on both sides of the web stack. This simply is not true. There is no enforcer at any company that is saying, well, you're a woman, so you need to be on front end. This isn't happening. This is false. And she doesn't stop there either. She goes on to say, women are typecast as front end developers while men work on the back end, where they generally earn significantly more money than their front end counterparts. Now, if you'll notice in the text there, she links to two different sources to compare men being on the back end and women being on the front end, and she shows how men make more than women on the front end. Unfortunately, she's not even really good at this, because if you'll click through to her links, you'll see that the link for back-end developers actually takes you to the average DevOps engineer salaries on Glassdoor.com. Now, what's the problem here? Well, that's not back-end. You literally looked up the wrong position. You did it right with the front-end developer position. That one's correct. But you're comparing it to something you didn't compare it to in your own article. Backend is not DevOps. They are two separate things. You couldn't even get that right. Now let's assume just for a second that she was using the correct sources. She was actually comparing backend to front-end development. The problem here is that she's using averages, and averages leave out variables that tell a much different story regardless of gender. Let's use Atlanta as an example. Imagine you're a company in Atlanta and you're trying to hire a Haskell engineer. Well, there aren't that many Haskell engineers, but there are a lot of Ruby on Rails engineers. So what does this do to labor markets? Well, if you're a Ruby on Rails engineer and you know that there are a lot of Ruby on Rails engineers in Atlanta, well, you know that from the company's perspective, they see a huge supply. They see a huge talent pool. They have options available to them. Contrast this to the Haskell scenario where there's only a couple of developers, but the companies want them. What this does is create a very different market where the Ruby on Rails engineers are more likely to compete against each other on price to get those roles, whereas in the Haskell scenario, you have the companies bidding on the limited supply, which increases their prices accordingly. The point here is that averages don't tell the whole story. Just in this example, in one location, we see two different types of back-end engineers who specialize in different languages receiving very different salaries just because of the labor market, just because of scarcity within a specific location that has nothing to do with gender. We see this on a global scale as well because new technologies are being created every day. If we were to go back to when Bitcoin was first released, there were a group of people who saw this new technology and saw the potential for creating companies on top of it. The problem is that there was no such thing as a Bitcoin developer. Bitcoin was so new it literally didn't exist yet. But thankfully, there were some people who saw the potential here and thought, why just be a programmer when I could be a Bitcoin programmer? Because as we know, with specialization that's in high demand comes money. Which is why it's so misleading to aggregate these titles up into base roles such as back-end and front-end when there's so much variance within them. There are so many variables that, if included, would tell a much different story. It's really not all that different from the gender pay gap. Miriam then goes on to close out her paragraph by saying, "That's not to say that women only work on the front end or that men only work on the back end. Far from it. But developers tell me that the stereotype is real." So Miriam, which one is it? Because just earlier in that same paragraph, you said the technology industry enforces a distinct gender hierarchy. But then later on in the same paragraph, you say that's not to say that women only work on the front end or that men only work on the back end. But trust me, developers say the stereotype is real. You have to pick one. It's either enforced or it's a stereotype. It cannot be both. Miriam then follows that up with a brilliant paragraph that's been said by nobody ever. She says, back-end developers often attribute front-end expertise not to mastery, but to alchemy, wizardry, or magic. Its adepts don't succeed through technical skill so much as a kind of web whispering, feeling rather than thinking their way through a tangle of competing styles. In other words, those soft, fuzzy things that women are supposed to excel at. That's not true, of course. Nothing on a computer is any more or less logical than anything else. First off, no back-end developer has ever said this in a serious manner. We say it in joking ways because we usually don't understand what the other one does. A back-end developer might say front-end is magic in the same way that a front-end developer might say back-end is magic. And it's because they do not understand it. But this idea that you're walking around a company as a front-end developer and all of your work is being attributed to feeling is complete bullshit. This has never happened. It's not true. She continues on with her gendered stereotypes of front-end and back-end development by saying, today, the case of the female front-end developer is repeating history in the opposite direction. Front-end developing is a feminizing subfield rather than a masculinizing one. Which I find a bit weird considering that I work as a front-end developer and I've never thought about my job in a gendered context ever. But this whole statement was a setup for her warning, which comes next, where she says, front-end developing is governed by the same market forces that edged women out of programming in the first place. Prestige accrues to labor scarcity, and masculinity seizes prestige. Well, bitches, seize prestige. The real message behind this article becomes apparent whenever she starts talking about coding boot camps and their potential to fix the gender imbalance within tech. She references computer historian Marie Hicks, who says she can't stand it when people tout coding camps as a solution to technology's gender problem. I think these initiatives are well-meaning, but they totally misunderstand the problem. The pipeline is not the problem. The meritocracy is the problem. The idea that we'll just stuff people into the pipeline assumes a meritocracy that does not exist. And there you have it. The meritocracy is the problem. That's the true issue here. They see companies who run their teams in ways that they wouldn't run those teams. They see companies who hire based on ability, with no preferential treatment for blacks or Hispanics or gays or transsexuals. They just want people who can do the job. But these people want that to be a factor. They think you should give preferential treatment to minorities. They said it themselves. The pipeline is not the problem. The meritocracy is the problem. Another way of saying equality of opportunity isn't the issue. Equality of results is the issue. But Hicks doesn't stop there. She continues with one of the stupidest statements I've ever heard. She says, these coding initiatives are consciously or not betting on their graduates' failure. What a great business model. We are going to teach people how to code, but we are secretly hoping they never get a job as a coder. Why would that make any sense? Especially when you consider some of their business models. Some of these boot camps have a payment structure where you only pay once you see results. It's unlike college where you pay up front and you might or might not get a job. Instead, these coding boot camps will do something where they'll teach you, and then once you get a job, you give them a certain percentage of your income now that you actually have the job. Why would they bet on your failure? It does nothing for them. They do not understand economics, which is probably why they don't understand the labor markets and their horrible statistics, which they use to back up this entire article. And by the way, those statistics weren't even right. All right, so takeaways. The first thing is, if you're looking to get into tech and you see an article like this where they say front end is completely devalued, especially if you're a woman, it's all magic, you're not a real programmer, that's complete bullshit. Do not believe it. It's not true. I've worked back end, front end, full stack. I've felt valued as long as I've done good work. It's complete bullshit. They're making stuff up. Don't buy it. Now, as far as the back end to front end pay disparity, we covered some of the variables they were leaving out earlier, but let's assume it's a true comparison here. Is there a pay disparity between front end and back end? Absolutely, or at least that would be my guess. And the reason I would make that guess is because of the perception of front-end and back-end development to beginners. Once you find out what those two are and what they do in the context of a web application, front-end is a lot more appealing in general. And that's because front-end is more concrete. You're typing on a keyboard. New things show up on your screen. You get to see it happen. It's literally what the user's interacting when they're using a web application. With back-end, it's a lot more abstract. It's a lot more of a mental model of this application. You're not clicking buttons on a screen. You're not saying, hey, look at this new modal I made. Instead, you just have a new URL you hit with some data and it sends data back. It's not that exciting. And considering that this article talked about front-end development being a feminized subfield, it's worth noting the overall trends within the industry. Because yes, tech is predominantly male. A small subset of that is women. But if you look at that small subset of women, the majority of them are in front-end development. So they are trying to put the blame for this trend on the industry, when to me it seems like you'd have nobody else to blame other than women themselves for pursuing what they find interesting. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please like and subscribe. And if you want to see more content like this, there's a link below. I have my own podcast, The Adam Morgan Show, with new episode every Wednesday.